Kentucky. A word so familiar, it feels carved into the heart of America. A name whispered in country songs, painted on bourbon bottles, etched into the soil of the bluegrass state. But behind that name lies a silence so deep, it unsettles even the historians who chase answers. Where did it come from? Who first spoke it? And what did it truly mean? Some say it was born in peace, a word for meadow or prairie. Others claim it was forged in blood, meaning dark and bloody ground. Two interpretations, worlds apart. One, a place of promise. The other, a land cursed from the beginning. And here's the chilling truth. After centuries of searching, no one can prove which is real. So how can a word so simple carry so many secrets? This is the enigma of Kentucky. A name that refuses to reveal its face, even as the world tries to pull back the veil. And to understand why this mystery grips so tightly, we must start with the one fact everyone agrees on: Kentucky is different. Most state names in America come with stories carved in stone. Virginia, named for England's Virgin Queen. Georgia, honoring King George. Louisiana, a tribute to the French King Louis. Their origins are undeniable, anchored in royal vanity or colonial pride. But Kentucky? It slips through history like smoke through fingers. No royal claim, no colonial decree. Just a word, unmoored and untethered, appearing suddenly in maps and journals with no explanation. What makes this even more unsettling is how central Kentucky became to the nation's story. It wasn't some forgotten outpost, it was the very edge of the frontier, the battleground where wilderness met settlement. A land of rivers, endless forests, and fertile valleys. A place so vital, so contested, so drenched in blood and legend, and yet its very name remains a puzzle. Why should a state so deeply woven into America's identity be the one whose name has no certainty? It is as if Kentucky was born with a secret, a shadow stitched into its very syllables. And unlike other state names, the theories don't merely branch in one direction, they clash. Some describe beauty, others violence. Some whisper of paradise, others of doom. No other state carries such duality, such contradiction, locked inside a single word. It's this contradiction that makes Kentucky different. It's not just a name, it's a riddle, a mirror reflecting two Americas. One dreaming of open meadows, the other haunted by war and loss. But where did this word come from? If not kings or queens, if not colonial decrees, then whose voice first gave Kentucky its name? To answer that, we must turn back to the echoes of languages that have nearly vanished, tongues spoken long before English claimed the land, whispers now buried beneath centuries of silence. Long before Kentucky became a state, its valleys and rivers carried the voices of nations that no longer exist. The Shawnee, the Iroquois, the Cherokee, and tribes whose names have been nearly erased, all spoke languages rich with meaning, words tied not to politics but to survival, to the spirit of the land itself. Some scholars trace Kentucky to the Iroquoian word kentake, a suggestion of meadowland or prairie, a name rooted in open spaces, where grasslands spread like oceans across the horizon. To them, Kentucky may have meant promise, a place of rest between journeys, where hunting was plentiful and the land gave freely. But then comes another voice, darker and heavier. Among some Algonquian tongues, the sound resembles words for at the field, or at the land. Simple, direct, but ambiguous enough to leave doubt. Was it a description of geography, or something more? And then there's the theory that unsettles the most. Kentucky as the dark and bloody ground. A phrase not tied to beauty, but to bloodshed. A land cursed by war and haunted by memory. According to some traditions, tribes considered this land contested, a battleground where no nation truly belonged, where alliances shifted, and where the soil itself seemed to drink violence. Each possibility paints a different portrait, one a sanctuary, another a nameless description. And the last, a prophecy of blood. The tragedy lies in the silence that followed. Many of the languages that might have solved this riddle were fractured by disease, war, and forced removal. Words that once carried clarity became echoes, scattered and distorted. What we are left with are fragments, sounds half remembered, meanings passed down through the uncertain lens of oral tradition, then filtered again through the ears of settlers who could not, or would not, hear them clearly. And so the question lingers like a ghost. Which voice spoke the truth? The one of peace, or the one of blood? By the time Europeans set foot deeper into these valleys, the name had already slipped into their maps and journals. But what they recorded was not the word as it was once spoken, it was what they thought they heard. And in that moment, the true voice of Kentucky began to shift. When Europeans pushed across the Appalachians in the mid-1700s, they carried more than rifles and axes. They carried ears untrained for the languages they would hear, and pens eager to turn sound into spelling. Words spoken by native peoples, fluid, precise, alive with centuries of meaning, were suddenly reshaped through foreign tongues. Kentake, Kentahdin, Kentucky. Settlers scribbled variations into journals and maps, each version bending the original sound into something new. To them, it was not about accuracy, it was about ownership. Naming was claiming. If you could write it down, you could make it yours. But with every stroke of ink, the truth was bent further from its source. The delicate threads of native meaning twisted into crude approximations, until what survived on the page was not a translation but an invention. And yet, the settlers did not stop to question it. They planted their flags and declared, "This is Kentucky." Still, the word unsettled them. It carried a weight, a gravity that seemed at odds with the lush valleys and fertile fields they saw before them. It felt heavy, ominous, as though the land itself whispered a warning beneath its beauty. And in the decades that followed, the land's history began to justify that unease. Because Kentucky was not simply a prize to be taken. It was a frontier drenched in conflict, where hunting grounds became battlefields, and where every clearing seemed to hide a story of bloodshed. The settlers may have thought they were shaping the land by giving it a name. But in truth, it was the land, and the name, that began to shape them. And soon, whispers spread that Kentucky was more than just a word borrowed and broken. Some believed it was a curse, a prophecy etched into syllables long before a single settler crossed the mountains. For if the name meant, the dark and bloody ground, then the land was only beginning to live up to it. The settlers had claimed the word. They had written it into maps, planted it onto deeds, and spoken it as if it had always belonged to them. But the word refused to rest quietly. Soon, whispers turned into legend. Kentucky was not merely a land of meadows and rivers. It was something far darker. The phrase, "the dark and bloody ground," began to cling to it, like a shadow that would not lift. Some said native nations had used the land as neutral hunting territory, but never as home, because it was cursed, too dangerous, too contested, too soaked in blood. Others insisted it was sacred, a place where no single tribe dared claim dominion, precisely because it belonged to no one. But the stories only grew darker with time. On the frontier, Kentucky's forests became a stage for endless conflict, between rival tribes, between tribes and settlers, and even among the settlers themselves. Every valley seemed to bear scars of battle, every river seemed to whisper of violence. To many, it felt as though the land itself demanded blood, and the name fed the legend. If Kentucky truly meant dark and bloody ground, then perhaps this was no accident. Perhaps the land had always carried a warning, etched into its very syllables, waiting for men to stumble upon it. The irony is chilling. Settlers who twisted the word into their own tongue may have unknowingly preserved its darkest meaning. A prophecy they could not read, yet one they would help fulfill. But here lies the danger of legend. Once it takes root, it becomes nearly impossible to separate truth from story. Was dark and bloody ground a genuine translation from lost tongues? Or was it a myth, born from settlers projecting their own blood-soaked history onto a word they barely understood? For centuries, scholars, historians, and linguists have tried to untangle that knot. They have sifted through fragments of lost languages, examined maps, and argued over meanings that never quite resolve. And yet, the deeper they search, the more the mystery only thickens. The mystery of Kentucky's name has never been left alone. For centuries, it has drawn scholars the way a flame draws moths, brilliant minds convinced they might be the one to finally solve it. Yet every attempt only seems to deepen the shadows. Linguists have traced the syllables through Iroquoian, Algonquian, and Siouan roots, pulling apart sounds like threads in a tapestry. Some insist it means, at the meadow. Others argue for, at the field. Still others cling to, river of blood, or, land of tomorrow. The sheer variety of theories is staggering, as if every culture, every scholar, has projected their own story onto the word. But the problem is this: there is no single, unbroken line of evidence. The native tongues from which the word might have sprung are fractured, many silenced by displacement and erasure. Oral traditions have been scattered, written records contradictory. Even early settlers, who left journals and maps, disagreed among themselves on what they thought they heard. Kentake, Kentucky, Kentuck. Each spelling carried its own interpretation, but none could capture the word as it was truly spoken. What frustrates historians most is that Kentucky's mystery is not just linguistic, it is cultural. Each interpretation comes with its own weight, its own vision of what the land was meant to be. Was it fertile paradise? Sacred hunting ground? Battleground of blood? Or simply, a word, stripped of poetry, pointing only to a field? And so the debate has never ended. Generations of scholars have argued in journals, at universities, and in books, yet no consensus has ever been reached. Each theory offers clarity, but none can stand as final truth. Kentucky remains a riddle, a word that refuses to be pinned down. But maybe that is the point. Maybe the real power of Kentucky lies not in what the word once meant, but in what it has come to symbolize. Because somewhere along the way, Kentucky stopped being just a name. It became something larger, a reflection of America itself. At some point, the chase for Kentucky's literal meaning began to fade, and what emerged in its place was something deeper. The word no longer belonged only to scholars dissecting syllables or historians debating fragments of lost tongues. It became a mirror, reflecting the contradictions, the violence, and the beauty of the nation itself. Because Kentucky's mystery is not just about what it means, but about what it represents. To some, it embodies the dream of America's frontier, fertile lands, endless horizons, the promise of tomorrow. To others, it embodies the nightmare, the blood spilled, the cultures erased, the uneasy silence of a land that never fully gave itself to any one people. Kentucky's very uncertainty mirrors America's fractured beginnings, where triumph and tragedy walk side by side. Think of it. A single word, yet inside it lives both paradise and curse. A meadowland of plenty, and a ground forever stained by blood. That duality, the inability to reconcile whether Kentucky's name promises life or warns of death, has made it more than a place on a map. It has become a symbol of how history itself is written. Half-truths, half-myths, stitched together from what has survived, while the rest is lost to silence. In this way, Kentucky is not unique, it is America in miniature. A land of contradictions. A story of opportunities shadowed by violence. A name celebrated, but never truly understood. And perhaps that is why the mystery still grips us. Because we sense that behind this word lies not just a forgotten translation, but something unspeakable, something that resists clarity, as though the land itself is determined to keep its secret. And so, when we whisper the name Kentucky, we are not simply naming a state. We are invoking a question that refuses to die. A question that leads us to the final, haunting truth about this word. Kentucky. A name etched on maps, sung in ballads, stamped onto history itself. And yet, for all our searching, it remains a locked door. Generations of scholars, storytellers, and dreamers have pressed their ears against it, hoping to hear the truth hidden inside. But the word does not answer. It does not bend to certainty. It stands silent, like the hills and valleys that bore it, refusing to surrender their oldest secret. Perhaps it was always meant to be this way. Perhaps Kentucky's true meaning slipped into silence the moment the first syllables were reshaped, carried away by the winds of time, leaving only shadows behind. Or perhaps the mystery itself is the meaning, that in never knowing, we are forced to confront the fragile nature of history. That words, like people, can live, change, and die, leaving only echoes. And so, Kentucky is more than a name. It is a riddle carved into the American story, a word that refuses to speak, yet will not stop haunting those who listen. And maybe that is why it endures. Because the silence is louder than any single translation could ever be.